Hey, good morning. All right, today we are going to talk about reconstruction. So we're going to start off with a good opportunity for a quiz. So today, this is your quiz question. Go ahead and make sure your notes are put up. And I will go ahead and start in about 5 minutes. part of that whole television thing, 'cause usually we just move on. All right. So somebody tell me, who are the redeemers?
The conservatives that had a part in rigging the elections to make sure that their party took office.
Okay, it was conservatives in the South. At that point, it was the Democrats who wanted to go back to the old way of doing things. So they were redeeming the South from Republican rule, from the rule of the North, which meant I can go back to putting down African Americans. I can have a dual system. I can have the old cultural elite who run everything. That's pretty much who they are. So what is the impact? Are they successful?
Yes.
Yes. Even though we have a Reconstruction, when we finally get to civil rights is the 1960s. What time is this?
1860s.
Yeah, 1860s. It takes almost 100 years because the Redeemers are effective and they pull power back and take power away from the Republicans who are trying to set things right. All right. So a lot of times in this class, we're supposed to start out in 1877, but I think if we kind of start in 1877, I want to make sure that everybody kind of has this grasp of where we're starting from. So we start with the Civil War. Civil War has happened. The North and the South are fighting. Any thoughts on why the North and the South are fighting?
African American rights.
Okay, so slavery and the South actually starts fighting over the North, saying, hey, you can't expand slavery anymore. So they secede, they leave the U.S., and the U.S. in the North says, wait a minute, you can't just leave. That's not appropriate. It's illegal. And so they fight to keep them in. Over the course of the Civil War, the North says, okay, you know what? Since you guys are being stupid, we're going to declare all of the slaves in the South free. And so it definitely becomes a war over slavery from both sides. A lot of people say that the Civil War ends in 1865. And it does, but it doesn't. This is kind of a weird situation. So when you was anybody taught the Civil War in high school? All right. When is the end of the Civil War?
When General Lee surrendered at the time.
Yes, that's when we always end. General Lee surrenders, everything is good, but it's crazy. There's a whole lot that happens after that. So let's go ahead and start. In 1865, you have Grant, the U.S. general, defeats General Lee from the South, and Lee is forced to leave Richmond. Now, I will start out saying, if you are going to start a new country right next to another country that's really powerful, it may be a good decision not to place your capital like 15 miles from the other country, especially when you know the other country is going to try to beat you up. I have never understood why the South did that, but they did it. Long story short, Lee has to leave Richmond. At that point, the capital is taken by the North. Is the war over? No. As you can see, Jefferson Davis, the president of the South, says, now we've entered a new phase of the struggle. We're relieved from the necessity of guarding particular points, so we're free to move and fight wherever we need to. So the South does not consider this a loss. Lee then surrenders at Appomattox. Again, this is where most people say, okay, the war is over. And yet, it's just one army that surrendered. It is the army in the East that everybody mostly knows about, but there's a whole lot of other armies. Next, Johnson, General Johnson and the Secretary of War for the South, Breckinridge, go up to Sherman and they say, hey, we would like to surrender. Sherman says, okay, I'm good with that. let me go ahead and take it back to the North. He takes it to Congress, and they're like, no, we're not accepting this because they are telling us what the surrender terms are. They are not accepting our terms of surrender, which is slavery disappears and you guys do what we tell you to do. So there is no peace yet. Finally, all these military leaders start to surrender independently as their armies are taken over. April 14th of 1865, Lincoln's assassinated. Now, if you run with Appomattox is the end, then Lincoln's assassination occurs by a U.S. citizen and it's an act of treason, correct? But if you're in the South, do you believe the war is over? No. These guys are still like, nope, the war's not over. We're still fighting. If we can take out Lincoln. Now it's interesting. What are the chances that the South has to win at this point?
0.
0. I mean, there is no way that they're going to win. But in their heads, they're still fighting this war. And they're like, we're going to take out Lincoln. So Lincoln's assassinated. Finally, almost a month later, Jefferson Davis, the president of the South, is captured. And then June 23rd, Stand Watie. Anybody know who Stand Watie is? Any Oklahoma people?
He was the only Cherokee general.
Yeah.
Civil War.
He is the Cherokee general. So, who was the last Southern general fighting? It is a Cherokee general who was fighting in Oklahoma. So, if you're from Oklahoma, you can, hold that up and say, hey, that's interesting. Finally, in April 2nd of 1866, President Johnson declares that the war is all over in everywhere but Texas. Anybody know why he says everywhere but Texas? At this point, Texas is such a mess that there's nobody to surrender. They don't have everything figured out. So up here, you see Lee surrenders, but August 20th, 1866, Johnson finally says, okay, there's peace. Everybody's good. All right. So what are things like now in the South? Is everybody happy? The war's over? No. There's a lot of people not happy. Why?
Because they're losing wealth, land.
Okay. So during the war, a lot of infrastructure is completely destroyed, right? So people who had a lot of money don't have money. If you had huge lands, now the slaves have been freed. How are you going to take care of those lands? Do you have the ability to farm? Well, why don't they just grab a combine and start rolling?
Those weren't a thing.
Thank you. Yeah, we don't have such a thing. It's still all manual labor. So can one guy handle 600 acres? No, it's not going to happen. The South is really angry because you have northern armies throughout the South. Do they want these armies down there? No, because they're telling them what to do. They're like, get out, go home. But the North's happy, right? No. Why?
They're the ones who are having to police it.
Yes. Does anybody in here have a family member that was military? Yeah. If they went over into Iraq or Afghanistan, are you happy while they're there? No. I mean, I remember my wife was really frustrated because at one point she finally said, you cannot volunteer to go over anymore. Please promise me that you won't volunteer to go over because I'm tired of sitting here at home wondering if you're going to come back, right? So you have all these people in the North. They're like, I want my husband, I want my son, I want my brother. I want my family back here to take care of the farm, to take care of the store, to take care of whatever, and not to be down there where people are shooting at them. So you have unhappy whites in the South, you have unhappy people in the North. What about the slaves? They're super happy, right? Because their life is now perfect.
No, they're poor too and have nowhere to just eat, sleep.
All right. Do not get me wrong. I am not saying people preferred slavery. That's not where I'm going. However, what is their life like, immediately following redemption? And you kind of threw it out there. What jobs are they qualified to do? do farm labor, right? So all they got to do is buy a farm and they're set.
With no money.
They have no money. So how are they going to buy this farmland? They can't. All right. But that's okay because, you know, they got a little nice house and they got some food set aside, right? No. Under slavery, they were living in a place owned by the landowner. So now they have no place to live, they have no food, they have no money, and they really have no job or opportunities to get a job in the immediate future, right? So these guys are also in a world of hurt. Now, the other piece, since Lincoln has been assassinated, Johnson is the vice president, he becomes president, right? Anybody know where Johnson's from?
South.
The South. Does this have an impact?
Yes.
Yes. So first, let's go back. Why would Lincoln put a Southerner in as the vice president?
Because back then, whoever lost the election was vice president.
Okay, not at this point. At one point, that was true.
He probably thought it would help his ticket to
Yes. All right. When you start watching elections, what do you see? The president who is strong in the East will grab a vice president from the West. A president who is strong in the North will grab a vice president from the South, you know, and vice versa, because you're trying to expand the number of people. So Lincoln's like, you know what? The South is angry with me. Maybe if I get a Southern vice president, then the South will kind of slow down and go, yeah, I get it. We'll come back and we'll work with you. He never expected that somebody was going to kill him and that Johnson was going to be the president, right? So this makes things a little crazy because you have a group of Republicans in Congress who are all like, the Southerners need to be punished. They need to have everything kind of drilled to the bottom and start over. And then you have Johnson who's like, you know what? Let's let the Southerners figure it out. So there actually becomes kind of a fight in government. And a lot of those arguments are these things. How do you reunite a country that's been split? Especially when half of those people, a third of those people, have been traitors, right? Because they said, we don't want to be part of this country anymore. What do you do with a traitor? Yeah, you execute them, right? So, easy. All you got to do is execute everybody in the South, right? And then it's all going to work again. Is that feasible? No. If I'm from the South and I know you're going to execute me, I'm starting the war back up, right? So it's not feasible to say, okay, let's go ahead and kill everyone in the South. So then the other option is just say, okay, you know what? Let's just forget it. Everybody's good. Don't worry about it. How does that work? Yeah, I mean, they're just going to go back to the way it was. And you're like, no, we fought for over 4 years. We're not going back to the way it was. This doesn't make sense. Who should pay the South's debts? Because they borrowed a lot of money to fight the war. Should Southerners get taxed extra to pay back those debts? Or should the North have to pay those debts so they will pay the debts of the country that actually fought with them? Or do you ignore the debts and say, you know what, if you're stupid enough to loan money to the South, you don't deserve to get your money back. Right? So what should be done with the slaves? It's easy, right? There's actually a group that says, all we got to do is send the slaves back to Africa. I mean, that's really smart, right? Just send the slaves back to Africa. Nobody's going to say anything. All right, so other than the folks that have immigrated here, because for you it's going to be an easy answer. If I tell you go back to the country that you came from, what does that mean to you?
there?
Well, you don't belong. And, all right, for me, that means like almost half of me would go back to Germany, and like a leg would go to England, and a little like portion of my arm would go to France, and right? How do I do that? How do I?
feel like they put their labor in on those grounds, so now they feel like they're, I guess, entitled to those lands.
Okay. Well, and the problem is, how long have some of these slaves' families been in the U.S. by this time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they have been over for decades, centuries, some, right? And so if I tell you, go back home, now again, is Africa like a town? No. What is Africa? It's a continent. Go back to Africa. What does that even mean? Right? So for me, go back to Europe. I don't have a town in Europe. My family hasn't been in Europe for over a century. So it doesn't make sense for me to be told, hey, go back there. You know, that's where you're from. It's crazy. Same thing for these slaves. Where would they go back to? Even if they knew the town that they came from, that's super difficult. And if your family hasn't been there for 300 years, it's not your country, right? It's not your continent. So what do we do? Do we give them property?
Education?
You give them an education, that makes sense, right? Some people said, hey, give them property. But then other people are like, wait, if you take the property away from the landowners, then you're going to start the war over again. So there's some real problems here. And I am not trying to get you guys to answer the problems, because realistically what I'm trying to tell you is there's no good answers to some of these questions, right? There are some really smart people there were people who were elected to guide the nation who really struggled with these questions. And, you know, how does the North ensure that the South will abide by what they're supposed to be doing? It's really difficult questions. So there are 3 different plans that come out. Lincoln says, hey, you know what? When 10% of the people in the South agree, then they can come back. Now, realistically, is that fairly easy? You'd hope so. In this class, you have 20 people sitting in this classroom. So 10% is what? Thank you. Somebody did public math, and you were right. As soon as 2 people in this classroom agree, so this classroom has rampant cheating. I know, you guys are like, no, we haven't cheated yet. But we will say for this thing, the rampant cheating, and everybody's cheating. I don't know who's cheating, who's not cheating. And I say, as long as 2 of you promise that you will quit cheating, we'll just move on. Do you think that the classroom will change? That there will be no cheating anymore?
No. You just
Probably not.
off the hook.
Yeah, because everybody was kind of let off the hook because 2 people agreed, right? But this is Lincoln's plan. And he was trying to say, let's get together, let's resolve things quickly so that we can move on. Johnson has a little different take. He says that it's the rich people's fault. If it wasn't for the rich landowners, if it wasn't for the plantation owners, this would not have been a problem. Let's not blame the poor people. Let's let the poor people come back and say, yes, we're loyal. But the rich people, the powerful people, you need to come and you need to stand in front of me and say, hey, I was really sorry. I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have done that because it was bad, and please let me back in the country. Kind of an intriguing perspective, right? By the way, Johnson hates the rich people. He's just like, you guys are bad. You've done a lot of stuff. He wants African American suffrage, but only if you're educated or if you served in the military. Why? Why those 2 things? What do they do for you?
Benefit him.
Okay, so if you're educated, you can read, you can learn what's going on in the election. If you served in the military, don't you think you have the right to vote? I mean, if you were willing to get shot and killed, then you've earned the right to vote. But he says only those two groups. But he wants lands returned to the former owners because he's afraid if we take away the land from the former owners that it's going to cause a lot more problems. Johnson says, all right, we're going to get white delegates and they're going to establish the governments and we're going to get everything going again. The problem is when they re-elect all the people, who do you think they elect?
White elite.
The same people that were in charge prior. Yes, the white elite. So they're like, wait a minute, you were in Congress before and you went to be a Southern general and you came right back. Congress went nuts. They're like, no, we're not going to allow you back. You are a traitor. You're not coming back. You're not representing your nation because you left. Send somebody who is not a traitor, right? So the Congress says, we're going to start doing some different things. They passed the Freedmen's Bureau bill. They're going to divide up the land and hand it out to African Americans. They're going to build schools with the money from selling things. They're going to have military courts. Why do you think you need military courts?
There's nobody else to enforce the law.
Okay, if you have civilians enforce the laws, they are still going to discriminate against African Americans. So they're like, nope, that's not going to happen. This is passed and Johnson vetoes it. Then they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is in direct response to the Supreme Court saying that no African Americans are citizens. You cannot be a citizen even if your family has had rights for hundreds of years as citizens. Because you're black, you're no longer a citizen. This happened in the 1850s, Dred Scott. And so they say, nope, if you were born in the U.S., you are a U.S. citizen, right? Johnson vetoes it, and this is the first time in U.S. history that they override a veto from a president. And then they're still worried about this. Can I overthrow a law? Can I get rid of a law in the U.S.?
No, a law in place?
Can I get rid of a law? Yes.
No.
Okay, actually can. All I have to do is the next Congress that comes in, change the law, right? Or take it to the Supreme Court. There's lots of ways to get rid of a law. So what is a lot harder to get rid of than a law?
An amendment.
Yes. So they said, let's go ahead and put a 14th Amendment saying that you have birthright citizenship. It gives equal protection under the law and go ahead and set up this process to where everybody has the same rights. Is it easy to change a constitutional amendment? No. All right. They then passed the Freedmen's Bureau over the veto. In New Orleans, the Democrats are frustrated. There's a Republican convention down there. There's a mob of people that come in and attack the Republican convention. When that happens, the police actually side with the people who are harming the Republicans. The people in Congress are like, no, we're not going to let that happen. So now they start the Military Reconstruction Act. If you notice, they divide the South into 5 separate areas, and they say, we will have armies and we will control the government with the army. It's under martial law. Males 29 and older can vote, which for us seems very restrictive, but at the time is pretty broad. That's an expansion of rights, because who is now getting the right to vote that never had the right to vote before? African Americans, yes. And then they said, if you want to come back, then you have to allow African Americans to vote and you have to ratify the 14th Amendment. Legally, I'm not sure that that passes muster. I am not certain that you can say that a state can't be part of the U.S. unless they approve a constitutional amendment. but it is what it is. There's some other Reconstruction Acts that say that the Army commanders are going to determine who gets to become citizens, who takes the oath of loyalty. Why do you think the Army commanders get to do that? They're the guys on the ground, and they're the guys who have the same mindset as Congress, right? There is no Supreme Court review of any of this. So constitutionally, it's questionable, but it still works. All right. Congress and the president get angry with each other because Congress is pushing the president to do things he doesn't want to do. They are telling the Army what to do. He's like, no, the president can tell the Army what to do. So they make a law that says, no, everything has to go through the senior Army commander. And he tries to fire the Secretary of the Army. And they say, you know what? We were part of creating, approving the Secretary of the Army, so you can't fire anybody that we approved. Is any of this legal? Probably not constitutional, but they still did it. Johnson's really ticked off, so he fires the Secretary of War. He goes to U.S. Grant and he says, hey, you're the 4-star general, come up here and you can be Secretary of War. Now, if you're Grant, is that a good decision? Do you want to tick off all of Congress? No. So Grant's like, thanks, dude. I'll stay right here. Don't worry about it. So then the president selects Lorenzo Thomas, but Stanton actually barricades, he shoves his furniture up against the door so that you can't move him out of the office. I'm kind of amused by that because I'm like, all you have to do is take the plaque off the wall that says Secretary of War and put it on a different office. But, there's this big fight. In all of this, the House decides that President Johnson has violated the law, which is correct, even though the law is questionable. And they're like, okay, we're going to impeach you. What is an impeachment? Everybody that's been around for the last 5 years knows impeachments, right?
They've charged him with crimes.
Okay, they charge the president with crimes, and this is the start to remove the president from office. Is this about guilt or innocence?
Yes.
It should be, but it never is. It's always about politics. So it's interesting, when you look at this, they charge Johnson with high crimes and misdemeanors. They give these reasons. They vote on it in the Senate, so the House charges him. The Senate votes. The Senate votes 35-19. It has to be a 2/3 vote. So one more vote, Johnson would have been gone. Intriguingly, the only reason that the last person does not vote to impeach Johnson, because he really hates him, is the person who is Johnson's vice president. He doesn't have one. So the person who was going to become president is, the Speaker of the House, right? I think. They hated that guy more than they hated Johnson. So they're like, I'd rather have Johnson and not this guy. That's the only reason Johnson's not impeached. Has nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It's, I don't like this other guy's, more. So, what happens under Reconstruction? A lot of good things happen. 600 African Americans are elected to key positions, governorships. They're elected to the House. They're elected to the Senate. They're elected to key positions in the states. Political power is expanded out beyond the rich people, and poor people actually get political power. They get influence and they get votes. They established true state governments. They abolished the black codes, which means, hey, if you're black, you have to be off the streets by 9. You have to have a job, or if you don't have a job, we can arrest you. There are a lot of things like that happen, right? So they abolish these. They create public schools in the South, which has not happened before this time. If you didn't have money in the South, you didn't go to school. They create public roads and railroads that are not just going from plantation to plantation so the cool guys can talk to each other, but they're going to expand so that everybody has a chance to be able to easily get from one place to another. And they create hospitals, they create jails, and they create orphanages. Are those valuable? So are there some positive things that happen under Reconstruction? Yes. All right. Election of 1868. Is Johnson going to be reelected? Yeah, I mean, he's in the middle of impeachment. So, yeah, he's probably not going to get picked. So, U.S. Grant, remember, refused to take the Secretary of War. That was a really good decision on his part because the Republicans select him as their presidential candidate. Why would you select Grant? How do people know Grant?
He's a war hero.
He's a war hero. So they're like, yeah, let's go ahead and get him. He accepts it and he says, you know what, let us have peace. And that becomes a Republican campaign slogan. The Democrats nominate this guy named Horatio Seymour. He is a Copperhead from the North, which means he said, hey, let's quit the Civil War, let the South be. So very much a Southerner supporter. So now you have a Northern general versus a guy who really supports the South. Horatio Seymour kind of just kills it because he selects Preston Blair as his vice presidential candidate. As happens in many elections, people start looking for what can I say bad about this other person. They find some letters where in a letter Preston Blair says, look, let's void Reconstruction and let the South do what they want to in the South. How popular is that for all the guys who fought 4 years and lost family members? So popular vote winds up being 3 million to 2.7 million. But if you notice the map, it's a pretty solid win for Grant. All right, once Grant comes into office, I hope you guys like my picture. They bring Texas, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia, admit them back to the Union. But in the South, you have a lot of people who are fighting to get back the Southern values that they wanted, right? They still want to have a two-tier system with whites on the top, blacks on the bottom. They want to have a system where wealthy people can control the poor people. And so they start groups. And what is the group that most everybody knows at this point? Yeah, the KKK. Grant is trying to fight this group and the other groups like it to say, no, you're going to do what we say. So they start coming up with all sorts of rules, the Force Acts. You can't gather in disguises on public roads or other people's property to violate citizens' rights. I mean, that's really explicit, right? Because you don't want little kids not to be able to wear Halloween costumes, but you got to make sure that you're very clear on what you're not wanting. And so this is a huge attempt to say we're not going to have the KKK going around burning crosses and burning down people's houses or buildings. So they place the national elections under the federal government and they put U.S. Marshals and judges in the polling places. Why do you think this might be?
Because the Klansmen were trying to scare off African Americans from voting.
Yep. The Klan, the other groups are, when you come to vote, it was a different way than we have now. You actually had a piece of paper, and that piece of paper said, I am voting for these candidates. So you're carrying the paper with you. The guys who are in the Klan, the other organizations, would come and they'd say, let me see your voting papers. When you pulled them out, if you're voting for the wrong people, then they would destroy your papers and they would beat you up and tell you to go on. So now it's like, nope, we're going to make sure that the U.S. federal government controls the voting. By the way, this is questionable legally, but it was one of the things they had to do to try to make the elections appropriate. They suspended habeas corpus in certain cases, which means you have to have a valid reason to put someone in jail. Again, this is a pretty horrible thing. I want someone to have a valid reason and prove to a judge that they need to put me in jail before they put me in jail. Why would they do this?
To be in control.
Okay, because if you know people are stopping folks on the way to elections, you got to stop that somehow. And so what you do is you put those people in jail for the election. Now, intriguingly, what does that do? That also tweaks the election because however they were going to vote, they don't get to vote. But the Southerners are more determined than the government, and at the end of the day, they start winning. By 1872, they passed the law, the Amnesty Act, and Southern officials who had fought against the U.S. are now allowed to take office in the U.S. government again. By 1872, there's a new election. People like Grant? Yeah, people are pretty happy with Grant. So they nominate Grant again. The Republicans nominate Grant. The liberal Republicans feel like he's pushing too far, pushing the South to do too many things. So they nominate a guy named Horace Greeley. The Democrats are like, we can't win with our separate candidate, but let's support Horace Greeley and then we will win. Because if we have the liberal Republicans and the Southerners, then we should be good, right? Interestingly enough, this is the only time this has happened in history. After the election, but before the Electoral College, Greeley dies. What does the Constitution say you do when your candidate dies?
Doesn't.
It says nothing because no one thought this might happen. So all of a sudden everybody's like, whoa, we don't know. So all of the people that are supposed to vote for Greeley, well, Greeley's dead. So they just pick different people to vote for. And so Grant wins overwhelmingly. Several states did not have their votes counted because there were too many electoral concerns that there was cheating going on. So Grant wins this election. This is an interesting piece here. Victoria Woodhull, I was told, several years ago that Hillary Clinton was the first woman ever to run for president. That's not correct. Victoria Woodhull in 1872 is the first woman to run for president. She doesn't win, but it's really intriguing. The first woman gets to run for president before women have the right to vote. So, all right. During this time, the South basically revolts again. Like I said, the South is more pushing for things than the North. So you have numerous occasions where mobs of people start killing hundreds of people to push their political agendas. Most often, it is white Democrats against black Republicans, although in some cases, in Charleston, black Republicans got angry because whites convinced other blacks to vote Democratic, and they were like, wait a minute, you can't do that. They're the people that made us slaves, and so they just started beating people up. Finally, the really weird one is there is a war in Arkansas. Two guys run for governor, and they actually get cannons and armies to fight each other to see who is going to win the election. So when you think that we have it difficult now, we're not quite there, thankfully. Grant does a few things. I'll probably pass over this because there's nothing that's going to be on your test, but I want to make sure that we get through the end. All right, 1876. In 1876, can Grant run again? You have 2 times that you can run. Legally, he could, but at that point, everybody said George Washington had 2 terms as president. That's enough for anybody, right? And so Grant says, all right, I'm stepping down. They are looking for someone to pick for their presidential candidate. What worked the last time? What did we say about Grant?
War hero.
He's a war hero. Rutherford B. Hayes, he's a brevet major general who did really well during the war. He's also a staunch abolitionist. So what's an abolitionist?
Somebody who fought for equal rights.
Someone who wants slavery to be over. Somebody who is an abolitionist says slavery is wrong and evil, and we want to get rid of it. So he is against slavery. He fought for the North. So everybody's like, yes, this makes sense. The Democrats nominate Samuel Tilden. He is the governor of New York, but he's also supported by the South. So they're like, okay, we can beat Hayes with Tilden. You know how elections always get called early? Yeah. So there's all sorts of people calling the election, and they're saying, hey, Tilden won. This is amazing. But there's some real problems. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina all send 2 sets of ballots. What does the Constitution say about this? It doesn't say anything. It's not supposed to happen. How do you get 2 sets of ballots? The white Southerners in the South said, we don't trust the federal elections. We're going to do this, and we're going to count it. The Army counted the federal elections. And so you basically had 2 groups of people who were trying to determine who won the election based on different information. And I'm pretty confident that there was some cheating going on somewhere, because they came back with different winners, right? So now you're like, okay, what do we do? The South is like, you know what? If Tilden doesn't win, we might go back to war. Anybody want to go back to war? No. So now they're trying to figure out, what do we do with these? Oregon comes in, and the guy who is bringing in the electoral votes is a deputy postmaster. That's illegal. So someone says, you can't do that. He says, fine. He resigns his position as the postmaster. Now everything's back to normal. They still have to figure out who won the election, right? Because these 3 states will determine what happens with the election. How do you do this? What does the Constitution say to do when you have differing perspectives? I mean, you already threw it out there, so. What does the Constitution say?
Say
Nothing. So how would you do this? How do you make sure that this is legal and fair to everyone?
The Electoral College?
Yeah, the Electoral College, but the Electoral College has votes that they don't know which direction they're going to go. So they sit down and they say, we're going to have an Electoral Commission. Now, to make sure that we are completely fair, we will have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. We will have an equal number of people from the Senate and people from the House. But what does that guarantee?
An even vote?
Yeah, it's going to be tied. So how do you break the tie? You can cheat. You go to the Supreme Court. There's one justice in the Supreme Court, and no one knows, is this guy a Republican or a Democrat? No one has any idea. But they all are like, this guy has great ethical standards, and he is not going to do something that's inappropriate. So this entire president election, one guy, right? Because every other vote you know. So if you know that, what do you think you might want to do?
persuade.
Yeah, you're gonna, hey, come over here. Let's work this out. So the Republican Illinois legislature elects him as a senator. So now he's going to vote Republican, right? Because he's a Republican. But it's interesting, that doesn't happen. He accepts the Republican position, but he resigns from the Supreme Court and he resigns from the Electoral Committee. He says, now I am not a centrist. I am now a Republican. It's not appropriate for me to make this decision. So the Republicans in Illinois blew it. Now, interestingly enough, when he resigns, the court selects as Joseph Bradley. Joseph Bradley goes in there and he decides that he's going to give the votes to Hayes. Hayes wins 185 to 184 electoral votes. When this happens, how do you think the South feels?
Mad.
Yeah, they're furious. Now, some people say that there was a meeting in a hotel and there was a decision and blah, blah, blah. We have no facts for that. I think the book actually says that, but there is nothing. One reporter from one newspaper said this happened, but nobody can tell us who was in the meeting. Nobody can tell us, anything about what happened in the meeting. So I don't think it's historically accurate. After 1877, when Hayes comes into office, the Democrats are angry, the Southerners are angry, and so the Democrats in the House and the Senate refuse to fund troops to be in the South. Can they legally do that? Yes. All funding comes from Congress. So if Congress doesn't want the Army somewhere, all they have to do is cut off funding. And the president cannot place the Army in a place that he does not have the funding. All right. So after the election, Hayes is forced to remove the troops from Louisiana and South Carolina, which is the only two places that they are still there. The power in the southern states returns to the pre-war leaders. So the KKK now is in control. The Army's gone. Now people with money and guns control the place, right? The federal law requires racial equality. How do you enforce those laws if the Army isn't there?
You have to rely on the politicians.
Yeah, you hope that they will do it, and they don't. So, what happens to Reconstruction? Reconstruction falls apart. Now, there's a question that says, is Reconstruction successful or not? What is the answer?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. You're absolutely right. It accomplishes some really good things, but because after 12 years, think about it, you have armies down in the South 12 years after the war is over. So the war itself lasts about 4 years. 3 times that amount of time, you still have armies down there. And after that time, you still haven't convinced people to change their thought process. And so as soon as the armies disappear, you go back to a 2-tiered system. There is not slavery, but there certainly isn't equality, right? So in 1960s, they finally put federal officers back in the South to enforce the federal, civil rights laws. And 100 years later, they're able to get the end of Reconstruction. All right. So, wow, we got about 20 minutes left. I wasn't good on my time. All right. So, what are the 3 plans for reconstructing the South? Just tell me the different starters first.
Lincoln's 10%.
Okay, so Lincoln, because yes, you're right, but I just want to, what are the names? Lincoln's?
Right off the top of my head.
No, Lincoln's, you guys can cheat. Lincoln, Johnson, Congress. All right, so I just said, for Lincoln, 10%, when 10% of the people agree, then we're good, right? All right, what did Johnson want?
Teach state ratified the 13th Amendment.
Okay. Each state can ratify the amendment. What else?
Leniency unless you were rich.
Okay. You can say, hey, I want to be loyal. Everything's good. Unless you're wealthy or powerful. What happens if you're wealthy or powerful?
To be like, hey, I'm sorry that I did this. Can you accept me back into the country?
Yes. All right. If you're rich or powerful and you held a big position or you owned a huge plantation, you had to go to Johnson and personally say, hey, I'm really sorry for what I did. I want your personal permission to come back to the U.S. Which, wow, that is pretty crazy to me. But that's what he's looking for. What else? What about African Americans?
First, to give some of them voting rights.
Some of them got voting rights. What did it require? Anybody remember?
Education and military.
Education or service in the military. All right? All right. One last thing. What about land? Is he going to give the land to all the African Americans who were slaves?
Go back to this.
Goes back to the landowners, right? Where does this leave the former slaves?
Homeless.
Homeless, with nothing. All right? All right. Why was Johnson impeached?
Because he was charged, go ahead.
They charged him with crimes, basically, because they didn't like him and they wanted him out.
Okay. They didn't like him. They wanted him out. They established some laws that said you can't fire someone unless we allow it. He fired someone. They also said that he was talking bad about them, which is true. He actually went on a tour of the U.S. telling everybody Congress was stupid, which is kind of a bad decision if you're a Republican and you have a Republican Congress, right? It's not the best way to make friends and influence people. So what's the result of the impeachment trial?
He was acquitted.
Okay, he is acquitted. He is basically left in office. Does that mean he was innocent? Okay, I got a shaking head. No. Was he guilty?
Yes.
By legality, he broke a law, right? Whether the law was constitutional or not, that's not his to decide. He could have challenged the law and taken it to the court. He chose to just break the law. So he absolutely is guilty, but he's like, doesn't matter. We're just going to do this. All right. So who are the redeemers?
Conservatives. Democrats.
Okay. It is the conservative Democrats. It's the powerful people in the South who had pulled the South out from the Union, started the Civil War, but they're still powerful, they're still influential, and so after the Civil War, what makes them redeemers? What are they redeeming?
South.
From?
The North.
Yes. They are redeeming the South and the Southern values, the right to have two groups of people with different value, different abilities, and different standards from Northern standards, which would say everyone gets to be equal, right? All right. What's their impact on the country? What happens to Reconstruction?
Fails, and the white elite politicians go back into office.
Okay. So the Redeemers basically kill Reconstruction, right? They prevent the North from pushing the civil rights laws. They prevent the North from being able to create an even platform for everybody to work from. All right. Finally, how successful is Reconstruction?
50-50.
All right. Yeah, I feel bad because I think I already asked this, but I want to make sure that you guys think through it. If you see that question again, what is the right answer?
Yes and no.
Okay, yeah, that is probably the perfect answer. I don't care if you put yes, I don't care if you put no, as long as you put why. And probably the best answer is it had some very positive things. What are some of the positive things?
13th, 14th, 15th Amendment.
Okay, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, which give people civil rights and birthright citizenship. All right. What?
Public schools.
Public schools that allow people to be educated.
African American can vote.
Say it again.
African American can vote.
African Americans can vote. African Americans actually get elected into offices.
From slaves.
They are freed from slavery. Yeah. Anything else?
It was a good foundation for, I guess, in 1960 when they.
Okay. So it sets kind of the foundations for civil rights. You get better roads, better railroads. You get a more even playing field for everybody across the area, right? So it's not just African Americans that were pushed down. There was a bunch of poor whites that were just consistently pushed down, because if you never get an education, are you going to be able to succeed as well as other people? Probably not, right? And by that, I'm not saying college education even. I'm saying if you're not taught to read and write, if you're not taught basic math, how easy is it for me to cheat you? Right? I can write whatever I want to say, and then I look at you and go, hey, this says I'm giving you $100, sign it. You sign it, and then the next thing you know, I'm taking you before a judge saying, no, he promised to give me all his cattle. You didn't know what you signed, but you signed it, or you put your X, and so now you're responsible, right? So by giving people an education, it gives them a little better standard. Okay, we can kind of start evenly. All right, so good things happen. Why is it bad? And part of that is, how does it end?
Pretty much the same thing happened over again, where the same politicians were back in office. So
All right.
African Americans once again were stripped of kind of what they had accomplished through all of that.
All right, so you have the same powerful Southern leaders take over political positions. How does this happen? Two parts. One, if I showed you three letters, what would they be?
KKK.
Okay, all right, you have these groups of people who decide, I'm going to wear a mask, I am going to force my opinion on you. If you don't like my opinion, I will shut you down. I will destroy your business. I will destroy your home, right? Sometimes it's kind of scary because there are some people that are kind of doing the same thing now. But if you think about it, it's pretty amazing that you have a group of people who are like, if you don't think like me, I will shut you down. I will destroy you. And they are able to make it happen. Why are they able to make it happen?
Because no one knows who they are.
Okay, because you can't take them to court because no one knows who they are. You mean, even though you really do know who they are,
Yeah,
you
but
can't
they could
prove
be-
it.
Yeah, they could be anyone. Like
Yeah.
they could be you, they could be me. Like
Yeah. And the second thing is, what happens to the northern armies that are keeping things under control?
The control went back to the states, so the federal had to go back.
All right. Once you have Hayes elected, the Congress takes away the money, the armies go away. Once the armies go away, who is there to ensure that electoral things, electoral laws are enforced? Who is there to ensure that everybody's civil rights are taken care of?
The KKK.
The KKK, and they do a marvelous job, right? No, just so we're clear. But yeah, the only people left are the people who are wanting to violate the rules and the laws. All right? All right, for the next class period. You guys should be super happy. There's only 3 questions. All right, this time we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. I like our book for the most part, but one of the things I don't like is the next 3 chapters kind of go all the way from, hey, here is the early or the late 1800s, right after the Civil War, and he goes, here's 50 years. Now, who in this class is 50 years old? Yeah, nobody. So basically, he's doubling the amount of time that you have lived so far. In your lives, how much has happened? Do you feel that things have changed? Yeah. And so it frustrates me because I really wish that he would say, okay, let's do 20 years and look at everything. Let's look at immigration. Let's look at how industrialization changes things. Let's look at the changes in the South and the West. But instead, he kind of lumps these 3 sections in different areas. So we're going to kind of talk about each of the different sections, and we're going to try to figure out how they work. But at some point, we want to kind of grab them again and put them together. All right? So, all right. You guys can disappear, and I will continue to talk for another 8 minutes. All right. Just, if you can do it quietly, please do. All right. So, I failed. So, I will try to run back to the Grant presidency. Grant is not politically savvy. He gets a lot of people on his cabinet that are not the best, that are not ethical. And so you see a lot of scandals happen. However, he is able to protect women's rights, which is pretty amazing for this time because, again, this is right after the Civil War. He pushes to separate women's property from their husbands so that if a husband goes into debt, they can't steal the woman's property and take it away from the family. He also finds out that the federal clerks, the women are paid differently than the men. And so he says, you know what? Everybody, if you're a federal clerk, then this is your money. You should be able to be paid what everybody else is. He also has a big impact. He has the first actual Native American person who is the Native American commissioner. He tries to determine, how do I make life better for Native Americans? At this point, very few people are willing to allow Native Americans to continue in the lifestyle that they have led for 100 years or more. But the intention is, okay, how do we help them? And the thought is, if we make them more American, if we make them more, and I know that's kind of a silly way to put it, but make them more like the people in the government, then that will help them. So they continue the reservations, but if a Native American citizen or if a citizen of a nation wanted to become a U.S. citizen, then they allowed them to do so. They said, you can have rights as a U.S. citizen as long as you accept Western ways. They actually ordered the Army to go ahead and force whites away from the reservations. Now, is this completely successful? Of course not. But they are trying to prevent the whites from invading the reservations at this point. They create agricultural training and schools for the Native American people. The intent is to teach them to become farmers so that they can be more like the white citizens around them. This is not what Native Americans are wanting, or I shouldn't say that. This is not what many of the Native Americans are wanting, but it's what some of the people in the East and some of the more westernized Native Americans think is going to be helpful. At the end, you still have incredible battles between both the North, between the U.S. and their armies, and between the Native American tribes. So it's a difficult time. but Grant is attempting to accomplish what he needs to accomplish. So, all right. I am actually struggling because not sure where to go now. But I'll recap. Reconstruction starts out later than most people think. It starts in about, the war is finally over in 1866. You have the armies down there. Once Congress finally gets frustrated and says, hey, the South doesn't get it. They lost the war. We are not going to allow them to continue on with their plans that they had before the war. We're going to have them change. They go ahead and implement the federal reconstruction of the South. They divide the South into the 5 areas, and they say, we are going to have armies who are going to force you to change and become what we ask you to do. Intriguingly, that is a lot like what they tried to do with the Native American nations. But they said, we're going to impose our values on you because your values are wrong and need to be changed. So they start the process, but the process has problems because unless you keep the armies down there, unless you physically force the change, it's not going to happen. The other piece is, how do you change people's minds? Force does not often change people's minds. It just makes them more aggressive in their thoughts. So Reconstruction is the North pushing the South to change their values. The South pushes back. They create the KKK and other organizations that say, we are not going to abide by the Northern values. We're going to abide by the Southern values. And this is when you start to see changes in why people think the Civil War happened, because now you have this aggressive pushback to say, this was about Southern states' rights, and we're going to have the way that we want to live no matter what you think. At the end of the day, the Southerners actually win the Civil War, not militarily, but because after 1877, you have 12 years, and when the armies finally disappear, there is no one who is left in the South to force the Northern values on them. And so the Southerners have another 100 years of discrimination and two-tiered system between the African Americans and the whites. So that's why I wanted to make sure we talked about Reconstruction, to sit down and say, this is a huge impact on how the U.S. changes and where it goes for the rest of our country's existence. So hopefully you will join us again in the future, and we'll see what happens. Like I said, this next time we're going to talk about industrialization. Then we're going to talk about the South and the West and immigration. So, thank you for joining us.